Hello and happy Valentine's Day. I thought I'd take the opportunity today to introduce you to some of the books that made me fall in love with reading and writing. And I've always wanted to be a writer, and I've always loved reading since quite an early age. It was really difficult actually to reduce the number of books down to the 12 that I have to, or 12 or 13 I have to introduce to you in this video. And some of them will probably not need much of an introduction. They'll be quite familiar to a lot of readers. But these are the books that really drew me in to the power of reading. So first of all, I wanted to talk about a book that I found when I was a child. It was when I started reading as a kid that I first knew that I wanted to be a writer and just continue reading as much as I could. And this book is The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which, as I say, probably doesn't need much of an introduction. I think most people are familiar with the story of the four siblings, Peter, Edmund, Lucy and Susan, who get pulled into the magical world of Narnia through the wardrobe and go off and have an adventure with a lion and a wicked evil witch and all sorts of talking animals and spirits, which just really drew me in as a child. It's actually one of several books in the Chronicles of Narnia series, and as I say, you're probably quite familiar with most of them. To me, the thing I loved about it was that magical world, and the fact that, you know, there was perhaps this possibility that it could be anywhere. You know, you could step through a door and appear in this utopian world with talking animals and you know, battles and magic. So yeah, this is probably the first book that I picked up. I could have also picked up or spoken about anything by Roald Dahl, really. He was my other massive book crush when I was a kid. But this one was published in 1950, the first one. So it's an oldie, but it's a classic, I think. The next book is one that I was introduced to through my studies at school, and that is the 1960 novel To Kill a Mockingbird. Again, probably one that a lot of readers are familiar with, and one that doesn't need a whole lot of introduction. So this was written by Harper Lee, published in 1960. The sequel to this was only published a few years ago, but in my advice, just stick to this one, stick to the classic. And when I was reading this, it was about the time the Boo Radley's Wake Up Boo was in the charts, so I think that possibly had an impact as well. But it's a story about a brother and sister, Scout and Jem, through the eyes of Scout, who's the daughter, of their lives in the deep south of America during the trial of a black man who's been accused of rape. And their father, Atticus Finch, who's a bit of an iconic character, he is the man who's defending this black man who's been accused. So it's about justice, it's about community, it's a coming of age, but there's just so much in it. And it's so beautifully written. I think one of the things that always stuck in my mind between readings of this is there's this description of the women in the heat in the beginning of the novel, which is just so beautiful, and for some reason I remembered that image even when a lot of the book had sort of drifted away in my memory. But it's, yes, an iconic novel. If you've never read this, I strongly urge you to read it. You know, it's a classic for a reason. It's just fantastic. The next book is one that I studied when I was doing my A-levels. It's I Know Where the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. And this is actually the second book of the series. I Know Where the Caged Bird Sings is the first book, but it's a book that I pick up so often that I've put it down and I'm not sure where I've put it. But it's actually a series of memoirs, 7 memoirs by Maya Angelou, who is just an iconic, or was an iconic writer, writer of poetry, just a fantastic writer all round. But these memoirs just stuck in my mind forever. The one that I really wanted to recommend, which is I Know Where the Caged Bird Sings, was published in 1969, and it covers the author's life from the ages of 3 to 16. And it's this exploration of this young black girl's life in South America after she's been abandoned by her parents. She's living with her maternal grandparents in Arkansas, in the American South, and you know, she says it's a novel about not fitting in, and but it's also a novel about overcoming challenges and overcoming really difficult situations. It explores racism, it explores you know, sexual abuse. There are some quite heavy themes and topics in this memoir, but she deals with it in such a way that's so accessible and with this sense of humour that you just want to keep reading on all the time. What I really love about Maya Angelou's memoirs is her really vivid imagery, and the descriptions in the opening of this novel where Maya is in church are just absolutely fabulous. I don't want to give too much away, but as I say, it's a gut punching memoir, but it's also just so beautifully poetic, just so beautifully written. And once you've read this one, you'll probably want to go on and read the whole series. This is the second one, which is called Gather Together in My Name. But I certainly recommend, if you're new to memoirs, I Know Why a Caged Bird Sings. It's just one of the most powerful and beautiful memoirs that I've ever read. Next, we hit the university years, and Sylvia Plath, The Bell Jar. Again, this is probably quite a familiar title to a lot of readers. This is one that I picked up in my second year at university. I thought I was oh so smart having read it. It's Sylvia Plath's only novel. Obviously she's more known for her poetry, but I really, there was something about this book, and if the books I've already covered were kind of teenage crushes, this is kind of the messy ex of my choices of books that taught me to love reading. I really loved it. But it's interesting, when I read it as a student, it had so much more of an impact on me than when I reread it more recently. I think I read it at the right time, but it's beautifully written. It's basically a very lightly veiled autobiography of a character called Esther Greenwood, who's based on Sylvia Plath, and she aspires to be a poet. She gets she wins a competition to spend time in New York, and everything kind of crumbles around her. There's so much potential, but she, on returning from New York, spirals into you know, a mental health crisis, and it explores that. So it explores the sort of 1950s American society, but it's just really compelling first person narration, and a really powerful exploration, a kind of coming of age, but also you know, overcoming so much in this sort of stark and honest novel, but as I say, sort of quite autobiographical as well. Just a beautiful novel to read. And also, when I was at university, I was introduced to Angela Carter. Angela Carter, I just love. She's one of my favourite writers. And so the book, which was one of the first ones, I think The Bloody Chamber is the first book of hers that I read, which is a collection of short stories. There's actually quite a few books that I'm not covering in this video, because I'm going to also do a big gothic book recommendation video. So some of my favourite books have been shuffled onto that list, but including The Bloody Chamber, which I'll talk about. But this is The Magic Toy Shop, which is a novel by Angela Carter. It's a magic realism novel. It was published in 1981. It's really rich in magical realism, and the thing I really love about it again is that really beautiful evocative description throughout the book. It's a coming of age novel again. Our heroine Melanie, she's orphaned. Her and her brother have to go and live with her sort of creepy uncle who runs a toy shop, and her silent aunt who never speaks, and her two cousins. It's incredibly gothic, it's dark, it's just a really interesting exploration of a girl of a certain age as she's sort of becoming aware of who she is and her identity. There's lots to enjoy here. Again, there are some quite difficult topics, so it might be worth having a look to see what's covered before you pick it up and read it. But as an introduction to Angela Carter's novels, I think this is probably my favourite. There are others that are probably better well known, like Wise Children, but lots of them. If you look, you'll find that, and heroes and villains I also really love, but this one in particular always stayed with me, particularly for the description of Melanie in the opening of the book as she's climbing up this, out of this, her window down this apple tree in a wedding dress that belongs to her mother. It's just beautiful, and a really thought-provoking book. In terms of poetry, I've written poetry for a long time, since I was at school really, but I stopped writing. I wrote a lot of really awful teenage angst poetry, and then I stopped for a while, and then one day I was in Waterstones and I was flicking through the poetry section again. I was at university at the time, and I came across this sort of short collection by a poet called Brian Patten. Brian Patten is one of the Merseybeat poets, famous in the 60s in Liverpool, and this collection of poems just drew me in immediately, and it kind of, the penny dropped that poetry could be accessible, it could be readable, it could be enjoyable. It didn't have to be completely opaque and overly contrived. It could be whimsical but still gut punching, and these poems just have stayed with me for years. And Brian Patten is, if you're new to poetry, a really good poet to pick up. I just think his poetry, along with Roger McGough, who's another Merseybeat poet, are really worth picking up as an introduction to accessible, funny, irreverent, gut-punching poetry. So that is my recommendation. Next, Rose Tremain, again a name that is probably familiar to a lot of readers. She's had a lot of books published over the years, but this particular one, Restoration, is one that I absolutely loved and that stayed with me long after I'd finished reading it. It was published in 1989, but as I say, it's one of many. I've read one of her books about the sinking of the Titanic. I've read another one of her books about a journey to the North Pole. She's written about all sorts of different things, but this particular book is about based in the late 17th century London, during the restoration of Charles II. It's about a character called Merivale, who wins the favour of the king for being a fool, really. He's sort of a foolish character who doesn't take anything seriously and becomes a bit of a joke to everyone around him. He marries one of the king's courtesans as a cover for the king, but then makes the mistake of falling in love with her, and everything comes crumbling around him. So it's a kind of a novel of a fall and then a redemption. It also ends in the Great Fire of London, which I just thought was fantastic. This was turned into a book into a movie in the 90s, but I just really love this book. And also there's a more recent sequel to this called Merivale that you can explore if you enjoy this book. But I really love the characterisation her. I love the world that she created, this 17th century London, and the humour, but also sort of the tragedy of this character who is capable of so much but kind of makes himself a fool to win favour. Next, another absolute favourite writer of mine, Sarah Waters. And the first book I ever read by Sarah Waters was actually Fingersmith, and it absolutely blew me away. But spoiler alert, I'm going to be covering that in my Gothic recommendation video, so I didn't want to mention that now. And actually, the book of Sarah Waters that I've picked up and reread several times isn't Fingersmith, it's this one, which is Tipping the Velvet. And this is a really lovely Victorian Gothic novel about a character called Nan. She's a young girl who works in an oyster bar in Whitstable and dreams of strutting her stuff on the stage, and falls in love with a male impersonator when she sees them on stage, and then sort of runs away to London to be with them. And it's about her, I don't want to say coming of age again, but it kind of is, her exploration of finding out who she is. It's about heartbreak, it's about loss, it's about redemption, but it keeps you reading throughout. The twists and turns that take place in this book are just fantastic. The different reiterations of Nan's life as she goes from this sort of innocent girl in an oyster bar to working on stage, to having to sell her body, and it just goes on and on, but there is a sort of a redemptive ending, but it's just a beautiful love story as well, and just worth picking up if you want a book that you can't put down. Tipping the Velvet is just a fantastic one to try if you haven't read anything by Sarah Waters before. Next I've got Kazuo Ishiguro, who you may know for Remains of the Day, probably his most famous novel, although this was probably one of the most popular, Never Let Me Go. And this is a story about some college students living together, Kathy, Tommy and Ruth. It's about young people, it's about their relationship, but as the book goes on, there's a twist to it as well. It turns out that they're all clones and they're being bred for their organs, basically. I don't think that's too much of a giveaway. I think it's quite well known what the book's about, but it's just beautifully written, again, really heartbreaking. It's based in a sort of dystopian alternative 1990s. And it's about the 3 stages of Kathy's life, and Kathy is the character who's telling us the story. But it was published in 2005, and I just think if you haven't read Ishiguro before, if you've not read Remains of the Day, this is a really accessible, enjoyable and heartbreaking book to get started with. I also wanted to mention Shirley Jackson. I absolutely adore Shirley Jackson, and another one of her books is going to be on my Gothic recommendations video. So at this point I thought I'd mention her short stories, and in particular The Lottery. The Lottery is an iconic short story. It's dark, it starts off, it's uncanny, but it's familiar, and it just reaches this incredibly disturbing ending. And so if you've not read any Shirley Jackson, it's a really fantastic and short read. You can find it online really easily, The Lottery. But this is a collection of a lot of her short stories, which is definitely worth picking up. She's also known for writing books such as The Haunting of Hill House and We've Always Lived in the Castle, amongst others. So she was writing in the 1950s in America. But if you're wanting an introduction, The Lottery is incredibly hard-hitting short story. And when I discovered Shirley Jackson, it just really fired up my love of Gothic literature, and ambiguous characters and just strangeness in writing. So she's definitely worth picking up. Another novel that I really love is Margaret Atwood, but the book I'm holding up here is actually a collection of her poetry. She's better known for her award-winning books such as Alias Grace, A Handmaid's Tale, The Testaments. There's just absolutely loads of novels. Oryx and Craig series is one of my absolute favourites of hers, and I've read nearly all her novels, but at this point I wanted to mention her poetry because she's lesser known for her poetry. This collection is 2007, but last year she also brought out a collection called Dearly, which deals with topics such as climate change, but this collection talks about family, isolation, mortality. What I really like again about Atwood, like as I do with Brian Patton, she's incredibly accessible. Her poems really stay with you, they really make you think. They're beautiful, and again, for people who perhaps are less familiar or less interested in reading poetry, she's another writer that's worth picking up. And I really love this collection in particular, but her new collection is also a really good read. Another poet that I really rate is Helen Mort, and this is the first collection of hers that I picked up. It's called No Map Could Show Them. So, and what it really made me realise is that you know, you can write about so many different topics that interest you in poetry, and again, it can be accessible and it can be hard hitting. In this collection, Helen Mort gives voice to forgotten women, including mountain climbers from the early 19th century and late 18th century. She's giving voice to these pioneering women who, you know, who took these challenges that have sort of been forgotten in history, but again, incredibly memorable. I love anything to do with mountain climbing. I'm not a mountain climber, but I read so many books and memoirs about mountain climbers. I don't know why, it's just something that I really love to read, and so this really ticked the box for that for me as well. But if you are interested in Helen Mort, she's got several collections. She writes fiction, she writes memoir as well, but this is the first collection I picked up of hers, and it really influenced me in my own writing. Finally, I've got one of the hard hitters from 2020, which is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. Maggie O'Farrell again has a whole back catalogue of books that you can engage with and enjoy, but the reason I picked Hamnet is any book that can make me sob for about half of it consistently has got to be a winner. It's just really, really beautiful. Hamnet is based in 1580s Warwickshire. It's the story of Shakespeare's wife. Shakespeare's never mentioned by name, but Agnes, his wife, is, and it's really her story. He just happens to be on the peripheries, and she's sort of like a wild, nature loving character who comes into contact with this man and falls in love, and they have a family. But this is really her story, and it's a story also about loss, about grief, and it's just a fabulous book. If you're interested in Shakespeare or you're interested in historical fiction, it's really accessible, but it's incredibly moving. And Hamnet, is interesting to know, is interchangeable for the name Hamlet. So Hamnet was their child that passed away, and again, I think that's quite well documented. But it's a really beautiful novel, really emotional, really brings that 16th century world to life. And oh my goodness, I sobbed. Get tissues if you're going to read this, I'm telling you. So that's my selection of books that taught me to love reading, or reminded me how much I loved reading, and also made me keen to continue with writing. But happy Valentine's Day, and I'd really love to hear about what books you love and what books have really touched you over the years, and any recommendations you might have. But if you've enjoyed this video, do please like and subscribe. And then one of the next videos I'll be doing, as I say, is recommendations for Gothic fiction, which is one of my real loves. So I can't wait to get that recorded and share it with you. But in the meantime, thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.